most big ideas have loud critics, but not Vet Futures, and its stewardship by RCVS, and BVA. Vet Futures has been subject to little serious criticism, partly because it has been headlong, while critical inquiry is unhurried. Partly because Vet Future believers ridicule doubters, by charging them with phobieism, or worse, microaggressions, as if to criticize a theory of change were identical to decrying change, and partly because, in its current usage, Vet Futures is the idea of innovation and revolution, jammed into a criticism-proof, jack-in-the-box. Furthermore, there is a resentment, which commentary, not even criticism, brings from those who are voluntarily, or elected to be, part of our professional organizations. Where comment, or criticism is given, it is taken badly when it is not entirely in line with their thinking. In that moment, the unwanted, and unwarranted comment, in their terms, becomes a harassment, a microaggression, simply because it unsettles. But here's the point. Because there has been no critical debate about this subject, how do you know what will be received well by the profession or rejected by the profession? It is almost inevitable that criticism, or comment will unsettle some, who look only to the outcome of the comment on themselves, and ignore, or are incapable of understanding the intent, or the opportunity criticism reveals in a broader sense. Thus, any unsettling commentary will always be deemed unconstructive, and therefore needing to be shut down, because of the outcome, when, in fact, the intent is quite different. This capacity for misunderstanding, this misinterpretation, will never serve the balance, validity, and truth of a big idea, and those that reference it. This is the unfortunate situation we now find ourselves in with Vet Futures, and those most closely identified with it. There are, in my opinion, at least 4 problems with Vet Futures and the role which the operators have in it, most obviously RCVS and BVA. Firstly, Vet Futures does not address the commercial aspects of clinical practice. Instead, it is exclusively self-regarding, and those that operate Vet Futures manifestly reject the commercial. Secondly, Vet Futures offers no insight into the history of our professional society, and how it has arrived at this point, or respect for the achievement, or wisdom of senior members of the profession, thus providing a nebulous, rather than solid, place from which to begin. Thirdly, Vet Futures has a confused vocabulary, and a confused view of where valuable experience, or help may come from. Fourthly, RCVS and BVA as agents of Vet Futures, cannot match the reality of their positions, with Vet Futures rhetoric. I have no doubt, that even at this point in this video, some are unsettled, and would wish to close down debate. Vet Futures, and the commercial aspects of clinical practice. Nothing in Vet Futures looks at the part of the profession which is most public-facing, the high street, fee-charging, clinical practice. This is where most of us are employed, engaged in doing most good for animal welfare, whilst generating a sustained business, in other words, also making a profit. Profitable clinical practice has been portrayed as corrupt, and venal, in the Vet Futures topic discussions, showing us just how poor an understanding the absolute requirement there is for profit, if the profession is to be sustained. To ignore this truth, that profitable, commercial veterinary practice, is the past, present, and future, undermines the entire credibility of Vet Futures. The high street practice is, and always will be the engine of the profession, and its primary place for delivery of enhanced animal welfare to our patients. Furthermore, Vet Futures, and its protagonists, particularly RCVS, have nothing which supports the enabling, implementing characteristics of commercial practice, most recently, rejecting advances from a major employer. Instead, they concentrate on alternatives. There is no credit, nothing honorable, nothing enviable found by Vet Futures in clinical practice, yet, without it, the profession cannot deliver anything of substance to our patients. Vet futures should start again with those in clinical practice, for, as the saying goes, those that can, do, and those that can't. And those in clinical practice put their work into practice, not consultancy, or research, or academe, or alternative careers, and they do it every day. Vet futures should inspire individuals to enjoy, develop, and comfortably conform to the needs of clinical practice, rather than the reverse. Vet futures, and how we have got to the present. In truth, the current position of the profession has not been reached by a series of radical changes from the time of the Veterinary Surgeons Act 1966. It has been incremental, with many small steps, implemented by those in general practice. It has also happened by a blend of design, response to social and market forces, and adoption of new skills, practices, and technologies. Above all, it has been characterized by change and progress. There are myriad examples, and to choose just three. Computerization of clinical records from the 1990s, which is obvious technological progress. Response to legislation driving the emergence of out-of-hours provision in the early 2000s, which is obvious progress in employment conditions. Adoption of normalized business management practices from the 1990s onwards, which is obvious progress in conformity with society's requirements and expectations. None of this has happened by accident. It has been led by those in authority, particularly in general practice, who have competently enabled progressive practices. The culture that exists in practice is one of change and progress, by considered quantal steps, with the adoption of opportunities as they arose. It is not outcome, goal-orientated, as is the Vet Futures approach. That way lies disruption, and revolution. Disruption and revolution are not romantic concepts, they are always characterized by loss somewhere, and, often, with revision, costs, reputational damage, and loss of trust. Vet futures should consider history, and use the culture at hand to address the needs of individuals, without resort to outcome-orientated practice. The historical model for achieving progress is manifestly successful, and has stood the test of time. Vet futures, and confusion in language, meaning, and references. There has been a stream of research pieces and commentaries on vet futures. It is plain that there is a confusion about language, particularly in respect of business practice. Articles fail to distinguish between leadership and management, or the meaning and value of profit, as examples. There is a redefinition of the word innovation to mean progress, and there has been a tone, which, in a postmodernist sense, assumes that because there are problems, particularly with the younger members of the profession, these must be framed according to rejection of the conventional and existing. Furthermore, this approach draws in hostile references to hierarchies, which are corrupt and tyrannical. To develop the particular example just mentioned, the idea of progress, as opposed to innovation, is the notion that our history is the history of scientific and animal welfare improvement. This has held sway for more than a century. But, this has now been replaced with innovation. Witness the appointment of a full-time post at RCVS encompassing leadership and innovation, not leadership and progress. Replacing progress with innovation skirts the question of whether a novelty is an improvement. Our world may not be getting better and better, but our devices are getting newer and newer. In a very practical sense, Vet Futures should understand basic business language and concepts, and it should be more precise about language, and reject current hostility. In its research, Vet Futures is also referencing the National Health Service, particularly in respect of a desired outcome of improved leadership. Putting aside this outcome-orientated approach to start with, using the NHS as a reference point for best practice looks a decidedly shaky premise. Clinical general practice is built around small independent enterprises, even those owned by corporates, and not around a state-sponsored monolith. Clinical general practices also have a flat hierarchy and are behaving, pretty much, autonomously, rather than according to ministerial edict and public policy. Lessons derived from a different species, like the NHS, should be treated with the same critical filter as we apply in our everyday work on clinical conditions in patients of differing species. We should not adopt NHS models wholesale and uncritically. Vet Futures should look to develop an understanding of, and a lexicon applicable to small enterprises, like veterinary practices, first, not last. Vet Futures, and the gap between rhetoric and reality, at RCVS and BVA. RCVS and BVA have developed a methodology for nearly all of their work, which references in some way or other, Vet Futures, for example in their respective strategic plans. However, it is difficult to understand what Vet Futures is now, because it is not coherent. At the beginning it was identified as a brand, such that it might encompass a wide range of activities, services, or products, and be identified with certain values, broadly seen as desirable. In the absence of a clear and sustained articulation of those values, this faded, and instead Vet Futures became a framework, a means of managing widely diverse activities etc. Most recently, as mentioned in the joint BVA/RCVS rejection of contact from Simon Innes of CVS, it has become an initiative. This is all so confusing. Vet Futures, through BVA and RCVS, could usefully go to their respective memberships, and ask the very simple question. What do you understand Vet Futures to be? Irrespective of the metamorphosis, and loss of meaning of Vet Futures, neither organization has been deterred from using it, and for a scientific profession this should sound alarms. Vet Futures needs to decide what it is now. In order to do that, those involved should be pausing in their headlong pursuit of whatever they see as Vet Futures outcomes, and rethink, now that Vet Futures is 5 or more years old. This is entirely normal business practice, and a reasonable request, especially for those who will be fulfilling whatever comes out of Vet Futures. It is actually quite difficult to see who could re-articulate what Vet Futures is currently. Up to now, RCVS has largely bankrolled Vet Futures, with a smaller contribution from BVA. Perhaps, RCVS should have the whip hand, and the controlling influence here, as a consequence. There are certainly indicators that RCVS expects to control matters, witness their authoritarian, controlling statement in their 2017 strategic plan. Our ambition, continuing to build on the foundations that have already been laid, we will work to ensure that the legislation and regulations that support us are not only fit for purpose today, but enable us to make the UK veterinary professions, and those allied professionals who work alongside them, the best that they can be into the future. RCVS intends to make the profession the best it can be within their terms of reference, rather than the professions, with a message of intention, that replaces legitimacy of leadership, and with a shortcut, based on authoritarianism. Herein lies a gap, between the rhetoric of Vet Futures, and the reality of RCVS behavior. The profession is going to get what RCVS sees as best, and the reasons are fairly obvious. In adopting the ideological shibboleth that is Vet Futures, there is, if not carefully controlled, an opportunity for revolution and chaos. RCVS represents order, and is mandated to preserve order in the profession. By controlling Vet Futures, RCVS will preserve its authority. RCVS does not have a benign influence here, and the tools at its disposal currently, are related to regulation. Regulation is a dead hand at best, ultimately stifling progress anywhere. Thus, RCVS may pay lip service to the idea of leadership, a Vet Futures darling, but it will constrain Vet Futures by the requirements of the paymaster, to preserve itself, a true cognitive dissonance. RCVS should more clearly articulate how the preservation of order, that is their remit, sits with the ambition of vet futures. BVA have used vet futures differently, seeing it as an opportunity to find common ground with RCVS in particular. Using the veterinary record, BVA's social media, and the BVA website, it is easy to see vet futures associated articles, particularly research, along with occasional commentary. What is difficult to see is where critical evaluation of history, the commercialism of clinical practice, and precision of meaning has been given a voice. BVA is a membership organization, and there can be no doubt that its members don't all subscribe to the values of vet futures, whatever they might be. There is clearly going to be diversity of opinion. Yet vet futures has become all-pervading in regards to policy. BVA could reasonably pause, and ask its members whether vet futures is delivering on its promise, whatever members might think that is. Vet futures has also become a means of prioritization for BVA, or more exactly, procrastination. Whatever vet futures is, it is slow, with their claims about progress being most appropriately made with a vast evidence base being an inherently cumbersome approach, and filled with vagueness, over what constitutes adequate evidence, and entirely contrary to other policy, such as the approach to diversity and inclusion, with BVA's reliance on anecdote, the narrowest form of evidence. This approach is glacial in terms of change and progress, and leaves no room for measured empiricism. The desire for this approach is also at odds with the rhetoric of vet futures, which is headlined with quickly finding areas of innovation, leadership, ambition, and diversity. For that to be true, then creativity, with all its attendant chaos, would be allowed to flow at BVA. However, this is not the case. Instead, the record is filled with posturing, especially in its editorials, where creativity is required of others right now, but not BVA. There is another way for both RCVS and BVA. This would involve ceding some authority and control for both organizations, which is a very difficult proposition for both RCVS and BVA. A critical appraisal of vet futures, with a revision of ambition and values, along with building bridges with the commercial sector, and adopting incremental business development principles, will achieve progress for RCVS and BVA. The resources are here, in senior veterinary surgeons, the commercial organizations, and the current leaders in practice, even if their goodwill is being tested. In conclusion, for those who are leading vet futures, pause, a rethink and a reorganization is in order to achieve meaningful progress in 2022. This video has gone into detail about a subject which may feel esoteric to those of us in practice, so, anyone could reasonably ask, why should we care about vet futures? The answer lies in who are using this banner, and how they are using up resources, paid for by subscribers and retention fee payers, soaking up money and time, for something that is nebulous, slippery, and almost impossible to understand. Whatever vet futures is, it has no firm basis to launch into any future, it has no relationship with commerce, and it has no understanding of what most of us do, most of the time. So, why should we put up with this? This video is a much longer format than usual, but please don't forget to comment. See you next time.